Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Bodhi Tree Buddhism, class number 24 of The Way to Buddhahood by Venerable Master Inshun. Those of you that usually keep up with us will know that we've had quite a few months since the last class. Lots of things have been happening. As you can see, I'm here on a different platform. I'm recording with Zoom and I'm going to post them up afterwards rather than doing them live. But the content's still the same, so don't worry about that. We're up to class 24, and last time we finished at quite a critical point in that today we are going to be looking at some content that's super central to pretty much all forms of Buddhism and almost all Buddhist teachings. In fact, there's a book out there by Professor Kalupahana called something like Causality, the Central Doctrine of Buddhism, or something like that. Anyway, so yeah, we're going to be talking about dependent origination, and we're going to be talking about the four holy truths, also known as the four noble truths. So without any further ado, let's jump on in to today's material. Okay, so as mentioned, here we are with the four holy truths and dependent origination. Let's just jump right in and do this first verse, shall we? If my screen doesn't lock up on me. Okay, and as you can see, because I'm not using Word here, so the text is a little bit of a different format to before. So 佛说解脱道，四谛与缘起，甚深主佛法，有事而显现. Now I can't scroll down because my screen is locking up, but I can read it anyway. I can do a translation on the fly. So the Buddha taught the path of liberation. There's two vehicles which don't lead to liberation, namely the vehicles leading to good rebirths in the human and divine realms, so as humans and gods. So these are the first two vehicles, and they're non-liberating. But we shouldn't discount them and just say, oh, because it doesn't lead to liberation, that's not real Buddhism. This is incorrect. And this kind of idea is actually quite common in many, particularly Western forms of Buddhism, this idea that sort of like, if somebody doesn't meditate every day, they're not a true Buddhist. This is silliness, and it displays that these people really don't know much about Buddhism. Anyway, enough of my griping about that. So this first line is saying, the Buddha taught the path of liberation. So when we're talking about all of these paths that are liberating, be it the paths of the Shravaka disciples that lead to the awakening of an arahant, a worthy one, or the so-called solitary Buddhas, or the fully awakened Buddhas, they're all liberating paths or paths to liberation. And so we've got to, with these three vehicles in mind, get a really good handle on line number 2, the four truths and dependent origination. So the four truths here is just shorthand for the four holy truths. It's the Seng Di, often called the four noble truths. And I think I've probably ranted at many other occasions about why I prefer to use the term holy rather than noble, even if English Buddhist sort of lingo tends to use the term noble. Now, the third line here, so all the deep dharmas of the Buddhas. Now, whenever you encounter this phrase in Chinese, 佛法, which is literally Buddha Dharma, you do have to be a little bit careful as to what it means, because it can mean some quite different things in different contexts. And we've mentioned, I think, on a few occasions, some of the differences, just even in this character, fa, Dharma. So we've talked about Dharma meaning like sort of the truth, capital T truth, capital D Dharma in the singular, like the Buddha under the Bodhi tree realized the Dharma, that kind of idea of Dharma. But we also have the term Dharma as teachings, obviously. So the idea that the Dharma is in classical Indian thought, it's sort of like the way in which people should act. It could almost mean religion in a certain sense, the way in which people should behave, prescribed behaviors is the Dharma. But in the plural, the term Dharma can mean quite a few other things as well. Now, one of the common ones, of course, is the idea of different phenomena, the different phenomena that make up the world. But in this context of talking about the Buddha Dharma or Buddha Dharmas, often it can refer to specific qualities or characteristics of the Buddhas. So Dharma can also mean a quality or characteristic. So in this case, it's a bit tricky. So when we're talking about, now we do know from the Chinese that this character here, zhu, means that it's in the plural. So it is the dharmas of the Buddhas. But exactly what does it refer to? Is it meaning the teachings of the Buddhas, or the truths of the Buddhas? We can actually just kind of bracket that off. Keep in mind that there are different ways of interpreting it. The point is that all of these dharmas of the Buddhas are revealed or shown in Chinese 显示 through the Four Truths and dependent origination. Now, the way I would like to kind of sort of sum this up is to say all the teachings of Buddhism, all the teachings of the Buddha can kind of be seen as various different expressions, or they should sort of basically be in conformity with some of these basic principles, and in particular, dependent origination. Now, without getting off too much for sidetracks, if I can give it like a simple example, like Buddhist cosmology. So in the classic texts, when the Buddha's talking about like how the world forms, how society forms, he was always talking about, like, let's say, like, oh, when this happened, because such and such happened, and therefore it led to something else. And then that something else led to something else. So it's sort of like one thing leads to another. One thing is a cause for another thing, or we can say that the result is dependent on various causes. So maybe we can just kind of keep it in that way. All the profound teachings of the Buddha and all the profound truths realized by the Buddhas are demonstrated or shown on this basic principle of dependent origination, of which the Four Truths is a very specific but probably the most important example. Okay, that was pretty abstract at this point. So keep this in mind, however, as we jump on into the rest of it. Okay, verse 66 here. This is pretty straightforward. First in Chinese, as always, 苦集与灭道 是谓自上帝. Okay, so normally, well, I should do the English way. Dissatisfaction, accumulation, cessation, and path, these are called the Four Holy Truths. Normally in Chinese, when you want to talk about the Four Truths, you just rattle off the four characters, one character each, which is 苦集灭道. But because the verses here are like five character verses, he's put and in the middle. So literally the Chinese is dissatisfaction, accumulation, and cessation, path. And these two go together in two pairs. Okay, which again, we're going to look into as we go in further. These are the so-called Four Holy Truths. Okay, so that's pretty simple. Now, what follows is then going through each of these four truths, dissatisfaction, accumulation, cessation, and path, and fleshing out some of the details of those. But just before we jump on in, it's important to sort of point out some relations here under this principle of dependent origination, which is to say that ku and ji, dissatisfaction and accumulation, or often it's translated as like origin, though I've left it here as accumulation rather than origin, just simply because of the Chinese character. So the Chinese character ji means like a gathering of things, as opposed to like an origin or a source of things. But in terms of meaning, it's pretty much the same thing. So there's a relationship between these. When you have the accumulation, the causes, you're going to get dissatisfaction as a result. And now we're going to find out, just like in about 10 minutes, 5 minutes, the accumulation here, the second truth, is effectively, in broad terms, what we call afflictions. So when you've got afflictions, you've got dissatisfaction. Now note the order that they're given. We first talk about dissatisfaction, which is the result, and then we talk about the afflictions, which are the cause of something. Now, it's worth mentioning sort of why not first talk about cause and then talk about effect. And the reason being is that most regular, not particularly awakened and enlightened people don't really have any problems with their afflictions. Greed, jealousy, pride, all these other, that's not a biggie. We only think they're a problem when we get the result of those, which is the dissatisfaction, the pain, and the suffering. And then we think like, I don't want this. So it's usually explained that they're listed in order of, the sort of apparentness to us as humans. We get struck by like, hey, this is terrible. Something's really bad happening, whether you want to just say, life stinks, or you want to say, I am afflicted with pain and suffering. When we have that feeling, then we start to think, oh, why is that? You want to try to do something about it. So we want to try to find out the cause. So that's for the first two truths. And the second two truths here, cessation and path, are also in many ways a similar kind of relationship. Now, most people, or most, I don't know about most, a lot of teachers then talk about this as another kind of cause and effect relationship, that effectively the path is the cause of cessation. So cessation is just a different word for nirvana. So technically here, the term in Sanskrit or Pali is exactly the same term as nirodha, which sort of can be like from suppression to cessation or destruction of something. And then the path, of course, is various things we engage in, from ethical behavior, meditation, developing wisdom, etc. And from this practice of the path, it leads to this result of nirvana or liberation. So often it's explained that dissatisfaction and accumulation or afflictions are worldly, mundane cause and effect. And by mundane means samsaric, leading to cyclic existence. Whereas cessation and the path are transmundane or liberating cause and effect. Okay, so that's a very useful way to think about these two things. And that immediately shows us that this kind of cause and effect relationship upon which the Four Noble Truths are built points to dependent origination. But I would like to just point out something like a slightly more subtle way of looking at it. And rather than looking at these four as two sets of cause and effect, they're not really two sets of cause and effect. They're actually one set of cause and effect. When we have afflictions, right, so that's truth of accumulation as a cause, leads to the result of dissatisfaction. When we have them, okay, when we have afflictions, we get the result of dissatisfaction. Now, the path is effectively the way to get rid of the cause. And when you get rid of the cause, what happens? You could say you get the result of nirvana, but you can also say you get rid of the result of afflictions, and that is called nirvana or cessation. So it's not actually two different cycles or sets of causality and result. It's one. When we have the cause of afflictions, we get the result of suffering. And when we get rid of the cause of afflictions, then we get rid of afflictions, which is called cessation. Okay, so it's kind of a subtle point here. I think it's definitely worth noting, though, because you can get into all sorts of sort of trickiness if you think of them as two different cycles of things. I won't go into all those tricky things. If you like Abhidharma and you really explore Abhidharma, some of those issues will come up, but maybe not for today. Okay, so for now, let's just remind ourselves. The Buddha taught the path to liberation, and all of these deep teachings of the Buddhas are shown, we can say, revealed or shown or demonstrated through this basic principle of dependent origination, of which the Four Truths is a sort of the classic example, but all our other teachings as well should be able to fit into this basic model, should be able to fit them somewhere into the Four Truths and somewhere into this principle of dependent origination. Okie dokie, what do we have coming up next? Okay, so now I've already kind of talked a little bit about like mundane cause and effect, or samsaric existence, and then transmundane or liberative cause and effect, which is the third and fourth truths. And now we're going to talk about these in a little bit more detail. So we've got a few headings, multiple nested headings. Mundane cause and result, okay, of which the first is the truth of dissatisfaction. And the classic way of talking about the truth of dissatisfaction is with the idea of the 8 dissatisfactions, the 8 forms of dukkha. Okay, so how does this go? Maybe I should scroll that up a little bit more. Okie dokie. 苦子求不得，缘会哀别离，生老与病死，总有五蕴聚。So dissatisfaction, or dukkha, is the Sanskrit and Pali term, what is it? So this character here, this is effectively like a little colon here, or kind of putting it in quotes, so-called dissatisfaction. What is it? What follows is a definition. Yeah, the first one is this one here, 求不得, literally seek, not get. Okay, not attaining what you want, not getting what you want. You want stuff and you can't get it, and that is very dissatisfying. Okay, what's the second one? Yan Hui. Now, normally in Chinese, this is slightly longer because it's, Master Yin Shun here writing this whole thing like in verse form, like many of these great Indian scholars, Nagarjuna, Aryadev, Asangavasubandhu. Bandhu. And when you write in verse form, you kind of have to sometimes pick your words very carefully, and you condense things to just fit it into your poetic structures. So normally in Chinese, it's not called Yuan Hui, it's called Yuan Seng Hui Ku. So just slightly longer. Anyway, it means association with the despised. Now, Hui is to come together with. Also in terms of like meeting, you gather together. And Yin is kind of like, can be like kind of like enemies and people you have an issue with. So often this term gets translated as like being together with people you hate. Now, that's definitely not wrong, but I would like to think of it in broader terms. So it's not just talking about people. It can be association with anything that you despise. Locked in a small room that's playing music that you hate, very painful, for example. And then this one, association with the despised, is paired with the third one, ideally, literally love, separation. So separation from the loved. So you can see these two kind of like two sides of the coin, if you use that expression. So things you don't like, and you're stuck with it, like in some circumstances, it's suffering. Or the things that you do like, you get separated from them and you can't have them. It's also suffering. So these become the forms of suffering 1, 2, and 3. Now, the ones that come next here, birth, old age, disease, and death, very, very standard. Usually when we list the 8 forms of suffering, actually, these ones here get listed first. And I think there's actually a very good reason for listing them first, and that they're just basically fundamental to kind of any sort of embodied existence or even non-embodied existence. So us as human beings, we're born and it's painful. We get old, and it's also not very fun either. We get not just disease, any kind of real illness or sickness, anything other than sort of perfect health, which is, who really has perfect health? Some people are like super healthy, it's true, but like it's pretty rare if it exists at all. And of course, death, which is also quite painful for most as well. So these often get listed as the first 4 in the sense of like, just like basic facts of life. And if we also think about, of course, the Buddha's own mission, so let's think right back to that, the lovely story of the Buddha, he grows up in luxury, etc., da, 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 da. And then at some point, of course, his father knows, he's predicted by the seers that he's either going to become a great world-ruling king or a great religious leader. And so he wants to shelter him from the realities of the world. However, old King Daddy can only do so much. And at some point, the prince says he wants to go down into the town, to the city, and see the people who he's supposed to be ruling in the future. And the gods so conspire so that he sees 4 things. Now, the first one isn't birth; it's actually old age, then disease and death. He sees a old person, all frail and suffering, diseased person. Imagine not. This isn't someone with like a cold. This probably isn't even someone with like COVID. This, imagine some real nasty pre-modern medicine, leprosy and stuff like that. Just horrifically painful. and then a corpse. So, if the old age and disease, that wasn't painful enough, well, don't worry, it'll end because you're going to die. So he's traumatized by this, and his charioteer tells, then the fourth slide, he sees the monks teaching a path for liberation. So the idea being that the Buddha, he sets out on his journey as an ascetic, before he's the Buddha, of course, and he wants to find a path beyond birth, old age, disease, and death. Now, I think in the story, it doesn't have birth because in his lifetime, he's already gone through that. So old age, disease, and death are things that he's going to encounter along the way. And people might think, well, why mention birth? Cyclical existence, you're going to die. If you're not liberated, you're going to come back and you're going to get born again. And I think actually that birth one in particular is kind of worth talking about a little bit more, in that, again, much can be said about this. Modern times and modern medicine is often very different from ancient times. And so a lot of our sort of medical things get put in the very hyper kind of sterilized environment of the hospital, and it kind of acts as this like separating barrier with our experiences of these. In ancient times, the idea of a woman getting pregnant and giving birth, it was an incredibly dangerous time for both child and mother. But even without that, even with modern medicine, birth, when you think of the experiences that the baby goes through of being squeezed out of the womb, it's, incredibly traumatic experience. And there are a number of modern, particularly transpersonal psychologists that talk a lot about this. Such therapies as rebirthing, some of the holotropic psychology systems, they really acknowledge that birth is this incredibly traumatic experience that can have very lasting impressions upon one's psyche, which affect the rest of one's whole life. So it's definitely worth kind of mentioning that. But as a whole here, it's these fundamentals of life, and then you get not getting what you want, getting stuck with what you hate, getting separated from what you love. That's 7. We've still got this last one, which is quite a bit more abstract, which is in general due to the amassing of the 5 aggregates. Now, often this gets translated as the 5 grasping aggregates. And yeah, it's a little bit, we can go into a bit of detail. It's a little bit technical, kind of the discussion, but often there's a really good argument these days that it's not the 5 grasping aggregates, but basically the idea that the 5 aggregates, which are the constituents that make up who we are as embodied living beings, this kind of foundation upon which all these other things are based. If we weren't embodied, we wouldn't have birth, old age, disease, and death. If we weren't embodied, we wouldn't have not attaining what we seek, etc., etc. So while such things as birth, old age, disease, and death are just out and out painful, not getting what you want, kind of less painful, but still very much dissatisfactory. But just having this embodied existence itself, which is unstable, it's constantly in a state of flux. That's this kind of very like subtle level dissatisfaction. It's not necessarily pain, but it's like this very base level stress or dissatisfaction. And so long as we have that, we are experiencing dukkha, dissatisfaction. Okay, now we're going to next get into the 5 aggregates themselves. Now, note, we're still talking about this first truth of dissatisfaction. So then when we talk about the 5 aggregates, when we're talking about basically the constituent parts. Now, the 5 aggregates is only one method for sort of analyzing or breaking down what we are as living beings, particularly as humans. I mean, most of these teachings, there are some other ones, and you might have just seen another one below this, which we'll get to in turn, but it's a very useful one. And that's the one that typically appears within this explanation of the 8 forms of suffering. Now, a lot can be said about this. So today I'm going to touch on it very briefly. Let's read through the verses first, at least. 所谓五云者，色受想行识，其事处处住，软着不能离。 So the so-called 5 aggregates are, and then a list of all 5 of them. Okay. Physical form. So rupa, the physical body. Second one, soul or sensation in Sanskrit. It's sangnya. Perception, volition, and cognition. Seizing cognition abides in many locations, tainted, grasping, unable to be freed. Okay, now the second 2 lines, the last 2 lines we'll get to in a sec. Let's just give some basic definitions for these 5. So physical forms, physical body, and that includes not just bones and blood and skin and hair and internal organs and so on and so forth. It includes the sense organs. Well, 5 of them at least. Now, eyes are physical: eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, tactile senses. Sensation, when our senses come into contact with objects, we have various sensations. And those sensations are classified in 3 ways. They're either considered to be pleasant, neutral, or unpleasant. Or we could say pleasant, neutral, or painful. So sensation here is describing that kind of affective aspect of our experience. The third one is xiang, so perception, a lot of different ideas. Oh, I should go back and say, sensation is often translated as feeling, and I don't like to use the term feeling simply because usually in English nowadays, we use the term feeling to actually talk about our emotions. You know, what are my feelings? Oh, I'm angry about this. So in Buddhism, anger doesn't come into this category here. Anger would be over here. So we've the term sensation. If you can come up with a better one, please tell me. The third one is perception. So xiang or sangnya. Oh, sorry, my mistake before. So sensation, of course, in Sanskrit is vedana, not samjna. My apologies. The third one's perception, and it's particularly not just perception, like seeing something and knowing what it is, but using like a word or a label, like or a concept to identify it. So when I look at the screen and I go screen, or I even just look at the white on the page on the screen and go white color, that is what is meant by perception. And it can take place through any of the senses, through things we see or hear or smell or taste or touch, as can sensation. Now, when we have then these experiences with sensations, pleasant, neutral, unpleasant, or we start to identify things with words and language and concepts, what might follow is some kind of volition. The term here, Chinese, is xing. And this character is used to translate so many things in Sanskrit, so it's like really ambiguous. Be careful of your context. Sanskrit samskara, which is literally kind of together makers. It's the compounds, and often it gets translated as like compounds or conditionings. It's really vague though in English, like what are the constituent elements that make up your life? Compounds. What the hell does that mean? But if we say like volitions, or actually, maybe I'll do it. I'm just going to go right out there and put in emotions. And I like emotions because emotions are literally things that make us move, right? They are emotions, things that like make us move. Don't know if English has a causative, but if it did, this would be one of them. And that's exactly what is meant by samskaras, things that act as sanskara. That skara is a kura, which is the same root term as karma, which means action or movement. So it includes not just things that would normally regard as emotions, compassion, love, anger, jealousy. It also includes many other things as well that get put in this kind of category, but they're kind of actions of the mind. Whereas sensation and perception, in a sense, are kind of passive. When we come into contact with objects, this, whether we experience pleasure or pain from that, or whether some concept comes about, it's kind of like almost automatic. It's very difficult to kind of like not have a sensation about something, or not to have some kind of conceptual association with an object. But emotions, however, are not quite so much. We've got a bit more room to work with them, and that's important because this category includes karma, and mental karma at this point. The last one is cognition, which actually in this kind of cognitive process that I've been talking about comes earlier. We have our physical senses that come into contact with different objects. Actually, the first thing that happens is we have a cognition. So if I see something, that's a visual cognition. If I hear something, that's an auditory cognition. and it doesn't mean it's got any content. If I look at the screen and I say that's a screen, me thinking that's a screen is actually a perception, not a cognition. Just looking, just seeing is the visual cognition. Just hearing is the auditory, the hearing cognition. And if I hear something, oh, that's a motorbike and it's really noisy and I don't like it. The thought motorbike is the perception and it's like unpleasant, I don't like it. That's my sensation. And then I like close the window because I'm driven by this volition or emotion because I don't like it and I want to close it. I want to block myself off from that, what I consider to be an unpleasant sound. According to the teachings of the Buddha, basically all the experiences that make up being a living being or being a human can fit into one or other of these five. The last two lines here, seizing cognition abides in many locations. So basically, this mental process that we've been talking about here, just it abides in many locations. Or we could really say like a many objects. All objects, we cognize things and then we get stuck on them due to this process of having these sensations and perceptions and emotions. Some other object to our senses presents itself and we do the same thing over and over again. This cognitive process is tainted grasping and we are unable to extricate ourselves from that situation. Okay, that's a brief intro to the five aggregates as one of the important aspects of the 8 forms of dissatisfaction, which is the truth of dissatisfaction within the scope of the 4 noble truths or 4 holy truths. We've still got more to go on this topic, got the 6 sense organs, 6 cognitions, different elements before we get into the truth of accumulation. There we go, basically karma, afflictions. However, that's enough for today. So let's wrap it up here. I should probably stop sharing the screen. Let's wrap it up here for today. It's good to be back. Give me any feedback that you have or thoughts or whatever on the classes, and we will see you again at some unspecified time in the future when I do the next class. Okay, hopefully it won't be too soon. Okay, thanks. Good to see you all. Take care.